Hello everyone. Hebrews chapter 1 is probably the place where I saw the first major crack in my own Trinitarian theology when I first began to investigate my own doctrine several years ago. And I was just reading through the chapter and asking myself honestly, what's this chapter really about? And I was doing that in sort of contrast to what Trinitarian apologists and theologians claim, that the writer's point in Hebrews chapter 1 is to illustrate that Jesus is to be identified as God. And as I was reading through this chapter, I realized, that's not his point at all. The entire chapter is about the exaltation of a man and how God exalted a man named Jesus to his right hand, and in this way Jesus became superior to the angels, as the Hebrew writer says in verse 4. And from there, I started to look at, various features of Hebrews chapter 1 and the Trinitarian claims. And one of those is, of course, Hebrews 1:8, which you'll see in Trinitarian translations, usually translated something like this: "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever." And I came to see that the big problem with this translation is that one-letter word, O. That one-letter word, O. Now let's just first look at verse 8 and 9 together. And I'd like to show you a pretty major problem with this Trinitarian translation. "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your fellows," or peers, or companions, or partners, translated in various ways. Take a good hard look at that passage as a whole, because here's what you have. You have this passage in the Trinitarian interpretation and translation identifying Jesus the Son as God, and then it says, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your partners. Do you see what's wrong with that? Just carefully think about it. God's God anoints God so that God could make God above God's peers. And I looked at this and I said to myself, is that really reasonable? A first century Christian leader, probably a Jewish Christian, was writing to other Jewish Christians to exhort them to remain steadfast in Christ and to refrain from returning to Judaism and the law. That's what the entire book of Hebrews is about. And we're to believe that this Jewish Christian writing to these other Jewish Christians not to return to the law is going to refer to the Son as, O God, and then say God's God anoints God so that God could make God above God's peers. If he's trying to be convincing to Jewish Christians, that's going to be a rather crazy way to go about it, I think. It seems to me to be extremely unreasonable to suppose that this translation is tenable. Extremely. And we all know what Trinitarian responses are like. They'll try to say, oh, well, this could be plausible, God the Son according to the flesh and all that. Because this is what they want it to say. But we have to ask ourselves, if we're being reasonable and honest with ourselves with this passage. Does this translation really make good sense? Is it really reasonable? If we are truly honest with ourselves. God's God anoints God so that God could make God above God's peers. Really carefully think about that, because that is the implications of their translation. That's what it says. God's God anoints God so that God could make God above God's peers. A second thing about this passage is that the Hebrews writer is quoting the Greek translation version of Psalm 45. And in Psalm 45, the psalmist is addressing a contemporary Davidic king. Now, scholars have debated for a very long time who this Davidic king is. But you'll find very few of them disagree that it, on the matter of whether it does refer to a Davidic king contemporary with the psalmist. In other words, the psalmist was writing about a king that lived when he was living. A contemporary Davidic king. Most scholars think it's Solomon, and I tend to agree. It's Psalm 45. That's the king who's being addressed. Some scholars disagree, but it's really a moot point for our intents and purposes here. We can easily see just by reading the psalm that it has to refer to a Davidic king, whether it's Solomon or David or somebody else, that lived when the psalmist wrote these words. Let's just start reading at verse 9. Just a couple verses after, the Your Throne, O God translation by Trinitarians that occurs at Psalm 45, 6-7. And we have this. King's daughters are among your noble ladies. Is that true of the exalted Jesus? At your right hand stands the queen in gold from Ophir. Okay? I think that was modern day Yemen or Somalia or the coast of Ethiopia, Somalia, that region in there. Does that sound like the exalted Jesus in heaven? Listen, O daughter, give attention and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house. Then the king will desire your beauty. Whose beauty? What king? See, he's talking about the bride here. Most scholars agree that this is about a Davidic king's wedding. Because he is your Lord, bow down to him. Okay, the ancient concept is that the husband was the Lord of the wife, as Peter talks about. Abraham was Sarah's Lord. The daughter of Tyre will come with a gift. Is that going to happen to Jesus in heaven? The rich among the people will seek your favor. The king's daughter is all glorious within. Her clothing is interwoven with gold. She will be led to the king in her embroidered work. The virgins, her companions who follow her, will be brought to you. They will be led forth with gladness and rejoicing. They will enter into the king's palace. In place of your fathers will be your sons, Okay, God's fathers, think about that. Jesus does not have any sons. Okay, God the Father is not our grandpa. Jesus is the firstborn among many brothers, children of God. You, this king, shall make them princes in all the earth. I will cause your name to be remembered in all generations. Therefore the peoples will give you thanks forever and ever. And so you can see, if you just really read that carefully, how it had to refer to an ancient Davidic king, probably Solomon, who lived when the psalmist wrote these words. And the best way to the evidence seems to be that this is about Solomon's wedding to an Egyptian princess. And the one mention of the king here, about the king's daughter, is the bride of the Egyptian king. But all that, all the details aren't that important. It's just that we have to recognize this has to refer to a Davidic king who lived contemporaneously along with the psalmist. That's not Jesus. Now you might say, well, Brother Cal, the Hebrews writer says it refers to Jesus. Yeah, so do lots of passages like this. Take Hosea 11:1. Out of Egypt I called my son. Go read it. It's about Israel. It says so explicitly. But Matthew applies it to Jesus. Read 2 Samuel 7:11-14. The Hebrews writer, in chapter 1, verse 5, this same chapter, says that refers to Jesus. Well, now go read 1 Chronicles 17:22 and 28. It says this was fulfilled in Solomon. David's son that fulfilled this was Solomon. There are several passages like this in the Old Testament which refer to a contemporary figure. It might have been a single person. It might have been all Israel. The suffering servant argument that you see people using, it's not either Israel or Jesus. It's both. All these things foreshadowed Jesus. And that's why Matthew, at Matthew 2:15, would take that verse at Hosea 11:1, which is about Israel, and apply it to Jesus. And that's because Jesus was the king of the Jews, the king of Israel, who died for all his people. And that's what Paul is talking about at Colossians 2:17. All those things in Israel, the law, and all the things that were happening were but a shadow of things to come. But the body that casts that shadow, or the substance, is Christ. All these things foreshadowed Christ. So Psalm 45 is just one of many examples which don't just refer to either Solomon or Jesus, but both. Okay? Or Israel or Jesus. It's both. There's several examples like this, and this is one of them. So we can see it has to refer to a contemporary of the psalmist, and yes, it does refer to Jesus, because Jesus is the perfect fulfillment of everything. These things were a shadow of what is to come, but the body is Christ. Colossians 2:17. So, if you look at this psalm then, or this verse, Psalm 45:6, your throne, O God, to the age of the age. There's something very wrong here. The Davidic king, whether Solomon or someone else, is being addressed as God. If we interpret it the way Trinitarians interpret it, we have this Davidic king who lived at the same time as the psalmist being identified as God. If we take the Trinitarian interpretation, there's something very wrong with that, obviously wrong with that. So there's two serious problems, and there's more, but these are the two most serious problems here. God's God anoints God so that God could make God above God's peers. And then we have the problem of an ancient Davidic king being identified as God. Something really wrong. And this should at least cause us all to look further and see if there's something else that makes more sense. And when we look, yes, there is something else which makes more sense. The words in question, which Trinitarian translators translate as "O God," are ha theos, which mean the God. Ha theos, which means the God, is the standard way the Greeks referred to God. Okay, in English, we just happen to capitalize the word God, and we don't bother saying the God, just capital G God. Well, they didn't have capitalization conventions in those days or anything like it. So when they wanted to refer to the one God, the way they did it is they would say the God. Okay? Without qualification. You know, you could call a pagan god the God, but you're referring to a specific pagan god if you're doing that. But if they just referred to the God without qualification, it referred to the one God. So you have, what we have here is a Greek term that needs to be questioned. Your throne, ho theos, to the age of the age. And ho theos, which means the God, is the standard way the Greeks referred to God. And it's translated as God or the God, depending what sounds better in English, where it always means the God. So why then do Trinitarian translators kind of resort to a unique thing here and translate ho theos as O God? Okay? It's translated as the God, or understood as the God in the New Testament. So why are they departing from that convention here at Hebrews 1:8? That is a question you need to ask yourself. And you need to ask yourself if they're doing this to promote Trinitarian doctrine. We must ask ourselves why translators would want to uniquely translate ho theos as O God in this verse rather than the God. Why don't they translate this as your throne, the God, to the age of the age? Because that's how they translate it pretty well everywhere else. But they want to do something unique here. And that's why this issue comes down to that one-letter word, O. O God, in Trinitarian translations. It's very subtle, but it has very big implications. Your throne, the God, to the age of the age. Well, what if it did say that? What if that's what it's supposed to say? Well, this entire chapter is about Jesus of Nazareth's exaltation to the right hand of the throne of God. That's what the entire chapter is about if you read it through. How God exalted Jesus to his right hand, something he's never done for an angel. And he's making this argument because these Jews want to return to the law. And he's showing them how Jesus has become better than the angels, verse 4. And how, the way of Christ is superior to the way of the law. Because Jesus has sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, the throne of God. Just look at what the main themes in this chapter. Verse 3, Having made purification for our sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Similar statements are made throughout the book of Hebrews, by the way. And then in verse 8 we have, your throne, the God, to the age of the age. And in verse 13, to which of the angels did he ever say, sit at my right hand? Sit down on my throne at my right hand. You see how that's just the prevailing theme throughout this chapter. Your throne, the God, to the age of the age. And what did Jesus say? I myself conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. Your throne, the God. Your throne, the Father, to the age of the age. Your throne, he sat down on his Father's throne. Your throne, the God. The point of Hebrews 1:8 is that Jesus' throne is his God's throne. That's the throne he sat down on. Your throne, the God. It doesn't mean God is his throne, like Jehovah's Witnesses essentially translate it. God is your throne, or your throne is God. That's not quite right. It means that he has sat down on his Father's throne. The idea here is that the risen Christ's authority is the authority that is signified by the throne of his God and Father. Your throne, the God. Jesus, the man, has been given the right to execute the authority of God the Father's throne. Okay? The word throne implies authority. You know, when a king sits on his throne, he's going to exercise his authority. That's what a throne signifies. And so when the Hebrews writer says, your throne, the God, he's expressing the idea that the man Jesus has been given the right to execute God's authority. God's authority, because it's from God's throne. He sat down on God's throne. And he's contrasting this over and against the angels. He makes his angels winds and his servants flames of fire. Okay? No big authority there, is there? But concerning the Son, your throne, the God, to the age of the age. Okay? So God's angels are his servants. And he says that again in verse 14. Where in verse 13 and 14, he's emphasizing the very same idea as he is here in verse 7 and 8. But concerning the Son, your throne, the God. You see, God has given his Son the right to execute all his authority. He placed Jesus over all the works of his hands, as it says at Hebrews chapter 2. He has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Matthew 28:18. God raised him far above all rule and power and dominion. Ephesians 1:20-22. The angels have been subjected to him by God. 1 Peter 3:22. He became better than the angels, or superior to the angels. Hebrews 1:4. Why? He sits on God's throne, exercising God's authority, and that's why the angels must bow down to him. He's sitting on God's throne. If you're sitting on God's throne, the angels must bow down to you. And Jesus said, he who overcomes will sit down with me on my Father's throne. And what does Paul say? We will judge the angels. Think about that very carefully. Your throne, the God, to the age of the age. I myself conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. Folks, I think if you think about this very carefully, you'll see what's going on here at Hebrews 1:8. If you can be honest and reasonable with yourself. To sit on God's throne means you exercise or execute God's authority, because that's what his throne signifies. You're ruling from his throne. If you're ruling from God's throne, that means you're exercising God's authority. It's similar to Joseph sitting on Pharaoh's throne, executing Pharaoh's authority. Same kind of idea. And we remember what Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Only in the throne will I be greater than you." It's the same thing with Jesus. And Paul talks about it at 1 Corinthians 15:27, I believe. Everything's been subjected to Jesus except, of course, the Father. The head of every man is Christ. The head of Christ is God. The verse is not referring to Jesus as God, but is referring to the idea that the risen Jesus sits on God's throne, executing the authority of that throne. Of that throne. So what about the Davidic king in Psalm 45 then? We still got to deal with that, don't we? Your throne, the God, to the age of the age. So can we say he was executing the authority of his God's throne? Let's say it was Solomon. Was he exercising the authority of Yahweh by sitting on Yahweh's throne? The answer to that question is yes. Then Solomon sat on the throne of Yahweh as king instead of David, his father. 1 Chronicles 29:23. The difference here is Solomon's authority was only over Israel. Just Israel. Jesus, Solomon's descendant, was given authority over all creation. But the way it works with Solomon and God or Jesus and God is exactly the same. It's that Jesus' authority is over more than Solomon's was. And listen to this in the same passage. All the assembly blessed Yahweh, the God of their fathers, and bowed low and worshipped Yahweh and the king. Worshipped Yahweh and the king. Why? The king sat on the throne of Yahweh. Then Solomon sat on the throne of Yahweh as king instead of David his father. Hopefully you'll have a better understanding now why the angels are bowing down to Jesus. He sits on the throne of Yahweh. Your throne, the God, to the age of the age, I myself conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. On his throne, your throne, the God. Jesus sits on God's throne, executing the authority of that throne. Folks, I think, once again, Trinitarian academics have miserably failed us here. I believe that they have been interpreting and translating this passage with one eye on their creedal traditions instead of having a heart for the truth. These answers are not hard to find. Surely, then, Trinitarian academics who have all the time in the world to find them because that's their job should be able to find them and see them. But I think they have gazed too much at their creedal tradition, the doctrine of the Trinity, and in their desire to conform the Bible to their creedal tradition, you have translations like you see in Trinitarian translations. Instead of seeking the truth, they're seeking to serve their idol, the doctrine of the Trinity. And that is something, if we are a servant of Jesus, that we just do not want to do. We want to love the truth and serve the truth. Because the truth is always of God. Truth begins with God. All good things begin with God. I hope that helped some of you. Bless God, and may God bless you.